A wealthy woman steps out of a black SUV on a busy street. A starving girl walks toward her with a silver bowl and a quiet plea. The woman does not reach into her purse. She reaches into her car. She pulls out a bottle of chilled water, unscrews the cap slowly, and pours every drop over the girl's head, while the whole street watches in silence. Then she drops the empty bottle, straightens her dress, and walks into the boutique like nothing happened. But here is what nobody on that street knew. Not even Alice herself. To understand what really happened on that street, we have to go back. 20 years back. And it begins on a night when the rain was so heavy that you could not hear yourself think, when a woman lay in a small clinic bed, fighting through pain that had been going on for hours, trying to bring life into a world that had already handed her a final warning. Her name was Alice. Not the Alice in the expensive dress, with the sharp words and the luxury car. See, that version of Alice had not been built yet. On this night, she was something much more fragile, a young wife gripping the edges of a hospital bed, terrified of failing. Her mother-in-law had made the rules of her marriage very clear from day one. One rule above all others: produce a son, or everything you have here will be taken from you. That was not a suggestion. That was not a warning. That was a sentence. And Alice had been living under it every single day since she married into the Collins family. Chief Collins was a good man, a wealthy man, a man who loved her. But love inside that house came with conditions that his mother set, and he never challenged. So as Alice lay in that clinic in the middle of the night, the pain of labor was not the only thing she was carrying. The first baby arrived screaming, loud and strong. The way people in that part of the country say a real fighter enters the world. The nurse lifted him up and announced what Alice already needed to hear. A boy. Alice closed her eyes. The relief that went through her body was stronger than anything the pain had been. A boy. She had done it. Her place in that house was safe. But then the nurse went quiet. A second baby came. Smaller, much smaller. And the room changed in a way that had nothing to do with the weather outside. The baby was a girl, and she had a mark behind her left ear, small and shaped like a star. Most people would walk past that mark without a second thought. But the nurse in that clinic, a woman named Sarah, was not most people. Nurse Sarah looked at that mark for a long time. Then she looked at Alice, and something moved behind her eyes that was not concern. It was not sympathy. It was calculation, the look of a person who has just seen something they can use. She walked slowly to Alice's bedside and lowered her voice the way people do when they want what they are saying to feel like a private truth being shared between two people who understand each other. "That mark on the girl," she said. "In my village, we know this mark well. A child born with it carries a pulling force. She will pull from the boy, his strength, his health, his life. If they grow up together, the boy will not survive it." Alice stared at her. "I have seen it before," Nurse Sarah continued. "Twice. Both times the boy did not make it past his third year." The rain hit the zinc roof above them. The boy was crying in the corner of the room. The girl was quiet, too quiet for a newborn. Alice was exhausted. She was alone. Her husband had not arrived yet. And the one thing she had just secured, her son, her place in the Collins house, her future, was now being told to her that it was under threat. She made a decision in less than 2 minutes. "What will it cost?" she said quietly, "for this to be handled quietly?" Nurse Sarah named her price without hesitation. Alice reached for her bag. When Chief Collins arrived at the clinic 1 hour later, his wife was holding their son with tears on her face. She told him their daughter had been stillborn. She told him the clinic had buried the baby already, to spare him the pain. She held his hand while he broke down. She did not look away from his face once. The boy was named Prince. The girl had no name. And somewhere in the heavy rain of that night, Nurse Sarah was driving away from the city, with a baby wrapped in a thin cloth on the back seat and an envelope of cash in her bag. Where she was going with that baby, Alice did not ask. She told herself she did not need to know, but the ground above a secret always remembers what was buried in it. Always. The baby arrived at St. Jude's home for the hopeless before sunrise. No name, no file, no explanation beyond what Nurse Sarah told the night matron at the door, that the child had been found and needed care. The matron asked no further questions. Children arrived at that place in all kinds of ways. She took the baby inside, and Nurse Sarah drove back into the dark without looking back. The women at St. Jude's did what they always did with children who came in nameless. They gave her one. Hope. Because one of the older caregivers said it simply, every child that walks through this door without a name deserves at least one good thing to carry into the world. And so, hope it was. She grew quietly in that place. She was not a loud or demanding child. She watched more than she spoke. She held on to things carefully: a spoon, a blanket, a small silver bowl that one of the caregivers placed in her hands on her 3rd birthday. See, she held that bowl the way children hold things when they already understand, without being told that things disappear. 7 years passed. Then, one afternoon, a car pulled up to the St. Jude's gate. A couple stepped out, well-dressed, composed, and carrying the particular kind of stillness that belongs to people who have been waiting a long time for something. Their names were Mr. and Mrs. Jude, married for 9 years. No children. They had spent those years trying everything available to them: doctors, treatments, prayers that went up and seemed to come back down unanswered. They had arrived at the orphanage home as a last step, not a first choice. They walked through the home carefully, looking at the children in the yard. And then Mrs. Jude stopped walking. Hope was sitting alone under the tree at the edge of the yard, holding her silver bowl in both hands, staring upward at something no one else could see. There was a stillness about her that was hard to explain, the kind that makes a person stop and look twice. "That one," Mrs. Jude said softly. And just like that, everything changed. For 5 years inside the Jude mansion, Hope lived a life she had never imagined possible. Her own bedroom, school uniforms with her name written inside the collar, teachers who called her name at roll call and waited for her answer. Mr. Jude took her to the market on Saturdays and let her choose her own fruit. Mrs. Jude sat at the edge of her bed on Sunday nights and asked her what she had learned that week. Hope believed every bit of it. She had no reason not to. Love, when it is the only love you have ever known, feels permanent, even when it isn't. She was 12 when Mrs. Jude sat her down in the sitting room with careful eyes and a voice that was working very hard to sound warm. The news was delivered gently: a pregnancy. A miracle, she called it. God had finally answered. Hope said she was happy. 4 months later, a baby girl came home from the hospital. They named her Mirabelle. And the day that child crossed the threshold of the Jude mansion, the air inside that house changed in a way that no one announced but everyone felt. It started small. Hope's bedroom was needed for something else. She was moved to the small room at the back, near the kitchen, where the house help stayed. Her school fees were paid late the next term. The term after that, they were not paid at all. The explanation given was short. Times are difficult right now, spoken without eye contact, on the same afternoon that 5 shopping bags from the most expensive children's store in the city were carried through the front door for Mirabelle. Hope cooked. She cleaned. She carried Mirabelle when the baby cried at night and rocked her until the house went quiet again. She was not called a servant, but she was not called a daughter anymore either. She kept her silver bowl on the shelf beside her small bed, the one thing in that house that had been hers from before any of them existed in her life. She held on to it, because it was the only thing that had never changed its mind about her. There are moments in a person's life that split everything into 2 parts: the life before and the life after. For Hope, that moment came on a Saturday afternoon when hunger pushed her past the gate. The Judes had left for a wedding early that morning, Mr. and Mrs. Judes dressed in their finest matching fabric, Mirabelle in a yellow dress with white shoes, the whole family stepping into the car like a photograph being taken. No one told Hope when they would be back. The kitchen was locked before they left. The key was nowhere she was allowed to look. She waited through the morning. She drank water from the tap outside and told herself it was enough. By early afternoon, it was not enough. She had not eaten since the previous night. A small plate of leftover rice that Mrs. Jude had pushed toward her without looking up from her phone. Her body was past the point of patience. Her hands felt light in a way that hands should not feel. When she stood up from her mat, the room leaned before it straightened. She was 15 years old, and her body was giving her a message she could no longer ignore. She looked at the silver bowl on her shelf. She stood at the back gate for a long time, just standing, just looking at the bowl in her hands. She knew what walking out of that gate meant. She knew how it would look, but her body had stopped caring about appearances. 3 houses down lived an older woman who had, one time, pressed a piece of bread through the fence with kind eyes and no questions. Hope had never forgotten that. She walked out. She knocked on the woman's gate quietly. She held out her bowl. She asked, with her eyes down, for something small to eat. The woman brought bread and a portion of stew and handed it over without a word, but with a look on her face that carried the weight of someone who had been watching a wrong thing happen for a long time and did not know how to stop it. Hope sat on the low wall outside and ate. For a few minutes, the world was manageable. She did not hear the car turn into the street. The Judes had left the wedding early. A headache, the driver said later. The car came around the corner and stopped. The door opened. Mr. Jude stepped out and stood in the street, looking at the girl sitting on a neighbor's wall with a bowl in her hands. He did not shout immediately. That was the part that stayed with Hope long after everything else faded. That he did not shout. He just looked at her, and his face settled into a decision that had clearly been sitting in him for some time, waiting for the right excuse to come out. "You are begging," he said. "I was hungry," she said. She stood up slowly. The kitchen was locked. He did not respond to that part. "You are standing on a public road with a bowl in front of my neighbor's gate," he said. "Do you understand what that looks like? Do you understand whose name you carry?" Mrs. Jude stepped out of the car. She took in the scene. Hope, the bowl, the neighbor watching from behind her gate, the few people on the street who had turned to look. Her face went flat. "Pack your things," she said. 3 words. Said the way a person closes a tab on a computer, quickly, without feeling, because the task has simply run its course. Hope went inside. She put her few clothes into the old bag she had arrived with 8 years earlier. She picked up her silver bowl. She walked back out through the front door. Her bag was taken from her hand and thrown through the open gate into the street. "We have our own blood now," Mr. Jude said. "We don't need this." The gate shut. Hope stood on the open road. Her bag was at her feet. Her silver bowl was in her hands. The sun was dropping toward the rooftops. The street was quiet in the way streets go quiet when everyone is watching but pretending not to. She did not break down. Something inside her had moved past breaking, had passed through it quietly in all those small moments over the last 3 years, and had come out on the other side as something harder and less easy to destroy. She picked up her bag. She began to walk. She had no direction. She had no plan. She had 15 years of living and a silver bowl, and the slow, heavy knowledge that every place she had ever been told was home had eventually opened its hands and let her fall. But she was still standing, and the road, wide and indifferent as it was, stretched out in front of her. The day Alice poured water on a child's head, the whole street watched, and not one person said a word. It was a regular afternoon, hot, busy, the kind of day where people move fast and mind their business. Alice stepped out of her black SUV in front of the most expensive boutique on the street, dressed in purple and gold, wearing the kind of confidence that only comes from never having been told no for a very long time. She was everything the street feared and quietly wanted to be. Hope was sitting on the ground near the boutique entrance, 15 years old, thin, her clothes worn down to almost nothing, her silver bowl held out in front of her. She had been on these streets for 3 months. She had learned quickly that this particular block, with its wealthy shoppers and imported cars, was where the money moved. She looked up when the SUV stopped. She stood and walked toward the woman in purple. "Please, madam," she said quietly. "Anything you can give." Alice stopped walking. She looked down at Hope the way a person looks at something that has fallen in their path, not with anger yet, but with the slow irritation of someone whose day has been interrupted. Then she looked more carefully at the girl's face. Something moved in Alice's chest in that moment, a feeling she could not name, like a door inside her had moved on its hinge without opening all the way. Something about the girl's face was familiar in a way that had no explanation. It was there, and then it was gone, and Alice did the only thing she knew how to do with feelings that confused her. She turned them into something harder. She reached into her car and took out a bottle of chilled water. She unscrewed the cap slowly, deliberately. The people on the street had begun to stop and watch. She raised the bottle and poured. The cold water hit Hope's head and ran down her face. She was soaking her shirt, dripping onto the hot ground beneath her feet. Hope froze, not from the cold alone, but from the shock of it, the absolute public nature of it. "Stop crying," Alice said, loud enough for the street to hear. "You should be thanking me. I am washing the smell of laziness off you. Use that coldness to wake up your brain. There is work everywhere in this city for people willing to find it. A bowl and tears is not a business plan." The crowd watched in complete silence. Nobody stepped forward. Alice's reputation on that street was too large, and people had learned long ago that stepping between Alice and her target was not something that ended well. Alice dropped the empty bottle, straightened her dress, and walked into the boutique. Hope knelt on the ground, soaking wet, her silver bowl still in her hands. A woman at the back of the crowd, old, with sharp eyes, watched until Alice disappeared through the boutique doors. Then she looked at Hope. She looked for a long time at the girl's face. She pressed a 50 naira note into Hope's wet hand without a word and walked away slowly, shaking her head in a way that suggested she had just seen something she could not fully explain but would not easily forget. Hope sat on the hot ground until the water dried on her skin. Then she picked up her bowl. And she kept going, because stopping was the one thing she had never been able to afford. Nobody hands a beggar a future. You build it yourself, coin by coin, day by day, in the spaces between surviving. That is exactly what Hope did. The first year on the streets was the hardest. She slept in an unfinished building 2 streets from the market. No roof, no door, just 4 walls that kept the wind off her at night. She shared that space with 2 older women who had been on the streets longer than she had, and who taught her, without softness, how things worked. Don't beg near the churches on weekdays, only Sundays when guilt is fresh. Don't let the market boys see where you sleep. Keep your money in 2 places, never one. She listened. She learned. She begged in the mornings with her silver bowl. In the afternoons, she went to the construction sites that lined the edges of the growing city and asked the site managers for carrying work. Most of them looked at her once and turned away. A few gave her a chance. She carried cement bags on her back for 10 hours straight on those days. Her hands bled in the first weeks. She wrapped them in torn cloth and went back the next morning. At night, she took in washing from the women in the nearby residential streets, collected it in a large basin, washed it by hand under a standpipe, folded it neatly, and returned it before sunrise so no one would see whose hands had cleaned their clothes. Every kobo she earned, none she kept in a small tin she buried under a loose floor stone in the unfinished building. She did not touch it for anything except food when the begging days were empty. She ate once a day when money was short. She ate twice when it wasn't. By the time she was 17, the tin was full. She moved it to a second tin. At 18, she rented a table space at the edge of the main market, the cheapest spot available. Nay, the one no established trader wanted, because it caught the afternoon sun directly and got dusty when the trucks passed. She set up what she had: small provisions, repackaged goods, basic household items bought at wholesale from a supplier who let her pay in small amounts over time. She sat behind that table every single day. She learned to talk to customers, not with desperation, but with steadiness. She remembered names. She gave fair measure. She stayed after the other traders packed up, one catching the last-minute buyers on their way home from work. By 19, the table had become a stall with a proper shade covering. She had 2 regular suppliers and a box of savings that had outgrown the tin entirely. By 20, she signed a rental agreement for a shop. A real shop, with walls and a door that locked, with enough floor space to stack goods properly, with a sign above the entrance that carried a name. Her name. The day she opened that shop, she placed the silver bowl on the shelf behind the counter. Not to use, not to hide, just to remember. Because the bowl was the beginning of all of it. The begging, the cement, the washing, the table in the hot sun, the 2 tins, the long nights, the slow climb. Every single step that had brought her to this door started with that bowl in her hands, outside a neighbor's gate. She was not going to forget that. She locked up on that first evening, stood outside her own shop, stood and looked at her name on the sign above the door. Nobody had given her this. Nobody. The house of lies Alice had built was still standing. Not because it was solid, because no one had yet walked up to the right wall and pushed. Prince had grown into a young man who carried himself like someone who had never once questioned whether he belonged. Good clothes. A car his mother bought him before he was old enough to fully appreciate it. A private university that he attended and called home from whenever he needed money, which was often. So he moved through life the way people move, when everything has always been arranged for them in advance. Alice watched him and called it pride. She did not know yet that what she was feeling was borrowed. Love given to a child who was not her blood, in a house built on a truth she had buried and never gone back to examine. It started on a Tuesday evening with no warning at all. Prince was at dinner with friends when his body simply gave out. He did not fall dramatically, or he simply became unable to continue. A weakness that moved through him fast, taking the color from his face and the strength from his legs. His friends got him to a hospital. Alice and Chief Collins arrived at the hospital within the hour. Tests were run, then more tests. Then a specialist was called in from another city, and the family was asked to come in and sit down. The diagnosis was a rare blood disorder, the kind that does not announce itself until it has already gone far. Prince would need a bone marrow transplant. Without it, the doctors said their words carefully, but the meaning was clear. Time was not on his side. Both parents were tested for compatibility immediately. Neither matched. The doctor explained that this could happen, that biology did not always cooperate. But he said it again, in different words, when he saw the look on the specialist's face. The probability of 2 biological parents both being incompatible was very low. He recommended that the family consider extended biological relatives. Alice sat in the hospital corridor after that meeting and held herself completely still. She understood what the doctor had not said out loud. She understood it the way a person understands the sound of something cracking beneath their feet. Not because anyone told them, but because the body knows before the mind will accept it. Chief Collins looked at her in that corridor. He had aged in the 2 hours since the meeting. His eyes carried something that was not just fear about his son. There was a question in them, a quiet one, the kind of question a man asks with his eyes when he is not yet ready to use his mouth. Alice looked away first. That night, After Collins fell into an exhausted sleep in the hospital chair, she sat alone in the family waiting room with her phone in her hand. She scrolled through a list of old contacts slowly, names from a life that had been put away 20 years ago. People connected to that rainy night in Umuahia, that dim clinic, that conversation she had pushed so far down she had almost convinced herself it had never happened. Almost. She stopped on one name, Nurse Sarah. She stared at it for a long time. Outside, the hospital was quiet. The corridor lights were low, and Alice sat in that waiting room with a weight on her chest that no amount of money or reputation had ever been able to lift. The weight of a choice that had never really left her. No matter how far she had walked from the night she made it. She pressed call. The phone rang, and somewhere, a truth that had been waiting 20 years began to move toward the surface. The call did not connect immediately. For a long moment, the line only carried the hollow sound of ringing. Then, after several tries, someone finally picked up. The voice on the other end was thin and tired. The voice of a person whose body had been in a long fight and was no longer winning it. But it was her. After 20 years, it was still her. Nurse Sarah. Alice traveled to find her the very next morning. She did not tell Collins where she was going. She said she needed air. She took her driver and gave him an address in a small town 2 hours from Enugu, a place she had spent 2 decades trying to forget. Nurse Sarah was in a hospital bed when Alice arrived, smaller than Alice remembered. The sharp, calculating woman from that rainy clinic night in Umuahia had been reduced by illness to someone who looked like she was already halfway out of this world. There was a drip in her arm. Her breathing was slow and careful. Alice sat down beside the bed. For a moment, as neither of them spoke. Then Nurse Sarah turned her head and looked at Alice with eyes that carried no more pretense, just the flat, tired honesty of a person who has run out of reasons to keep lying. "I was wondering," the nurse said quietly, "how long before you came?" What came out of that hospital room over the next 30 minutes was not a confession delivered with drama or tears. It came out slowly, in pieces, the way old walls come down, section by section, without warning. See, Nurse Sarah had not simply taken the baby girl to the orphanage that night. She had done something else first. Her own sister had given birth that same night, in the same clinic, in a back room, to a baby boy that the sister could not afford to keep. Nurse Sarah had looked at that boy, then looked at the healthy male infant in Alice's room, and made a decision that changed 4 lives in a single night. She had switched them. The boy Alice had been handed, the boy she had held up as proof of her worth, the boy she had named Prince and raised for 20 years, was not her son. He was her sister's child, her own biological nephew. And Alice's real son had been placed in the orphanage along with the girl. Alice sat very still. "Your daughter," Nurse Sarah said, "the star-marked girl. She is the only blood you have left in this world. The boy you love is not yours." Alice drove back to Enugu in complete silence. She did not cry. She did not speak to her driver once during the 2-hour journey. She stared through the window at the road moving beneath the car. And somewhere in the city she was returning to, without knowing any of this, Hope was opening her shop for the morning, stacking shelves, greeting customers, building her day with her own 2 hands. The same hands that carried Alice's blood. When 2 families who threw away the same girl start looking for her at the same time, the world has a way of making sure they find more than they bargained for. Alice moved fast. Within 48 hours of returning from Nurse Sarah's bedside, she had hired 2 private investigators, pulled every record she could find from St. Jude's Home for the Hopeless, and confirmed through a contact at the orphanage that a star-marked baby girl had been admitted 20 years ago and adopted at age 7 by a family also named Jude. The Jude name stopped her cold for exactly 1 second. Then she kept moving. The Judes, for their part, had begun their own search 3 weeks earlier, driven by a grief that had cracked them both open in ways that comfort and money could not reach. Mirabelle was gone. Their biological daughter, the child they had chosen over hope, the child for whom they had locked kitchens and thrown away bags and closed gates, had died in a domestic accident at age 5, and the silence she left behind in that mansion was the loudest thing either of them had ever lived with. Mrs. Jude had told her husband, in the weeks after the funeral, that she believed they were being shown something, so that the cruelty they had given to an orphan child had returned to them in a form they were not prepared for. Whether that was true or not, neither of them could eat well or sleep through the night anymore. They hired people to find hope. Both searches, Alice's and the Judes', led to the same address. A shop in Enugu. Alice arrived first. Her driver parked across the street, and she stepped out, already preparing in her mind the words she would say to a young beggar girl she expected to find in some difficult condition. Grateful, perhaps, or at least reachable. What she found made her stop walking in the middle of the road. The shop was not small. It was busy. Customers going in and out, a young man arranging stock near the entrance, the sound of a transaction being completed inside. And standing at the counter, in clean clothes, with her hair neat and her back straight, Hart was a young woman of about 20, giving instructions to her worker with the calm authority of someone entirely comfortable in their own space. Alice looked at her face. The feeling that had passed through her chest on the street 5 years ago, outside the boutique, when she had poured water on a young girl's head, came back now with full force. The same face. Older, stronger. The same bone structure that Alice saw every morning in her own mirror. She did not move from the middle of the road. The Judes arrived 4 minutes later. Their car came from the opposite direction and parked just down the street. They stepped out, looked at the shop sign, and then looked through the open door. Mrs. Jude's hand went to her mouth. Mr. Jude stood completely still. The girl they had moved to the back room. The girl they had stopped feeding. The girl they had thrown into the street with a bag and a closed gate. She was standing inside her own big shop, in her own space, one with workers behind her and customers in front of her and her name above the door. Hope looked up. She saw Alice on one side of the street. She saw the Judes on the other. She recognized every single face, and she did not move. She stood behind her counter, steady, quiet, and completely in control, and she waited for them to come to her. Because this time, she was not the one holding out a bowl. They were. There is a moment in every story where the people who caused the pain finally have to stand in front of it. This was that moment. Both families walked into Hope's shop within minutes of each other, and the air inside that busy, well-stocked room changed the second they crossed the threshold. Hope did not stop what she was doing immediately. She finished counting the change she owed a customer, handed it over calmly, and watched the customer leave. Then she turned and looked at the people standing in her shop. She recognized every single face. She said nothing. She simply waited. Alice moved first. She walked toward the counter and then did something that nobody in Enugu who knew her name would have believed possible if they had not seen it with their own eyes. She went down on both knees. Right there, on the floor of a young woman's provision shop, in front of workers and the open door of a busy street. Alice Collins. The woman in the purple dress, the woman whose heels had clicked away from a kneeling child without a second look, knelt down with her hands pressed together and her face fully open for the first time in 20 years. "I hired investigators," she said, her voice unsteady but pushing through. "After the hospital, after everything the nurse confessed, I needed to know where you were, what had become of you. They found you here, standing in your own shop. You running your own business." She stopped for a moment. "I cannot tell you what it did to me to hear that." She looked up at Hope directly. "You are my daughter, my biological child, the one I paid to have taken away because I was a coward who was more afraid of losing a mansion than losing her own blood. There is no explanation for that. There is no word big enough for what I did. I'm on my knees in your shop because it is the only place I belong right now. Below you, asking for something I have no right to ask for." The shop was completely still. Then the Jude stepped forward. Mr. Jude spoke first, his voice low and heavy with a grief that had not left his face since Mirabelle's passing. "We gave you a home, and then we took it back," he said. "We treated you like you were temporary when you were never supposed to be. We have nothing that can fix those years. But everything we have, our house, our wealth, everything, we are placing at your feet. Not as payment, as acknowledgement. You were ours, and we failed you. That will not happen again." Mrs. Jude stood beside him with her eyes full, nodding at every word her husband said. It was at that moment that Alice turned and saw the Judes clearly for the first time. Her expression shifted. "Who are these people?" she said, rising from her knees. Her voice had changed, the grief in it replaced by something sharp and protective. "You raised her? You are the ones who threw her into the street at 15 years old? You locked her in the back room like a servant, and now you are standing in her shop promising her wealth?" Mr. Jude straightened. "We are here to make things right." "You put my daughter on the road." Alice's voice cut across his like a blade. "You starved her, you used her and discarded her, and now you want to stand here and offer her a house." "And what did you do?" Mrs. Jude fired back, now her grief suddenly replaced by something sharp. "You threw her away the night she was born. We at least gave her 8 good years before we failed her. What did you give her? An orphanage and a lie?" The shop erupted. Both families were talking at the same time. Voices rising, fingers pointing. 20 years of damage and guilt and grief all colliding in the middle of one young woman's shop floor. Hope watched it. She watched 2 families who had each caused her enormous pain, now fighting over her like she was something to be won. Like her forgiveness was a prize, and whoever argued loudest would take it home. She reached behind her counter. She picked up the silver bowl. She held it up. The room went quiet. Everyone turned to look at her. Alice, the Judes, her workers, the people who had stopped outside the open door to watch. Hope looked at the bowl in her hands for a long moment. The worn surface. See the weight of everything it had carried. Every road, every rejection. Every morning it had been picked up again. Then she looked at the camera. "If you were me, what would you do? Would you choose the mother who gave you life, but could not give you love? Or the parents who gave you a home, but took it back the moment they no longer needed you?" She paused. "Or is it finally time for the beggar to stop waiting for people to choose her and walk alone?" She held the bowl with both hands. And she let the question sit in the air, open, heavy, and entirely unanswered. The answer is coming. If this story moved something in you, hit that like button, share it with someone who needs to hear it today, and subscribe so you do not miss part 2, where Hope finally makes her choice. The truth hits every person who deserves it. And the most powerful moment of this entire story is still ahead. We will see you there.